For many, Fiji is the land of fun, sun, and smiles. But scratch beneath the surface of this picture-perfect place, you'll find a local community that has been dredged through years of conflict and division. So, how did this small island nation in the South Pacific become an epicenter for disruption and disharmony? And why did there come to be such a large Indian population who call Fiji home? How did two cultures coexisting on this island lead to 30 years of coups and controversy? In 1874, Fiji became the newest jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a country that had the perfect climate for the mass production of sugarcane. All that was needed was the workforce to cultivate it.
The idea at the time was that there was a need to also maintain Indigenous Fijians' way of life. Also a need for the British to maintain some level of relationship with the Indigenous community. And that basically meant that they didn't want to ruffle feathers.
The Indians, they were adventurous looking for the world, and Britain was hiring them for work all over the place, Mauritius, Guyana, Fiji.
So, in 1879, at the behest of the Australian Sugar Refinery Company, the Girmit scheme was put in place. The ship, the Leonidas, carrying the first 522 Indians, or Girmit, left Kolkata, India, bound for Levuka, Fiji. 61,000 more would follow.
It's a bit like why the Chinese were taken to Samoa, why the Solomon Islanders were taken to Queensland. The whole business is based on the need for cheap labour.
Segregated from the outset, the Indians, the Europeans and the Fijians lived in isolation from each other.
And the Indians were never allowed to live with the Fijians. They were always kept separate. The Indians lived on what were called lines out in the sugar plantation.
If you take a look at the conditions that as human beings, regardless of ethnicity, you'd think about it as, man, this is hell.
That hell came to an end in 1916 when the Girmit scheme ended. And as the labour contracts finished, some of those indentured labourers returned to India, but tens of thousands chose to remain in Fiji in search of commercial opportunities in the sugarcane plantations. Over time, this population would grow to pose a perceived threat to Indigenous Fijians who were desperate to protect their lands and customary rights in their own country.
For the Indigenous communities, more focused on preserving their way of life. For the Indo-Fijian communities, there was really a need to progress and persevere beyond what was the initial conditions, which basically meant that aspects like education was valued, and also establishing a means of survival in a more socioeconomic sort of structure that was building around that time. And that enabled a lot of that progress for Indo-Fijian communities.
So, from the ashes of indentured labour, the Indo-Fijians rose to become business leaders and the predominant wealth holders in Fiji. Perhaps this is the spark where that colonial idea of segregation began to fan the flames for future coups.
To me, coup culture is inevitable in a way because we have not resolved our colonial hangover, because our two major ethnic communities see colonialism very differently. And because the legacy of colonialism has, in a way, divided the society. So in that way, it sort of creates this difference that will make it inevitable that there's always a struggle. And that idea of who owns what over who.
I think on a political level, there was always this us and them. So we were more worried about our land, and the other race was more worried about equality politically. So that sort of caused the problem in Fiji.
In 1970, Fiji gained her independence, But it did not take long for the young nation to tear herself apart from the inside. Controversially, in 1987, the colonial system of divide came to a head with the election of a new coalition government, perceived to be in support of the Indo-Fijian population. This was to set in motion the country's first cultural and political upheaval.
I was working at the Fiji Sun at the time. Leading up to the coup itself, we were publishing a whole lot of stories about, possibilities about overtaking government.
There were demonstrations. They had formed a indigenous group called the Tauke movement, and they started a process of destabilizing the government.
I guess the politicians at the time were still politically naive, but I think there's always the underlying suspicion that the Indians would come in, take control, strip the indigenous population of their land, their rights and their values.
Waiting in the wings of this social unrest and ready to flex its muscle was the might of the Fiji military.
I think on a per capita basis, we probably have the largest military in the world.
Militaries in small countries are unnecessary, and that's what produces the culture. So I think it's an entirely military culture, and it's an imported military culture, mostly British.
Just 1 month after the new coalition government was elected, Colonel Sitiveni Rambuka would emerge from obscurity and change the face of Fiji.
On the day of the coup, we had soldiers come into our offices with M16 guns. I've never seen a gun before in my life, so that was quite a shock. So we were told to pack our bags and get in the buses and go home.
It is a form of recognition.
It kind of shook the fibre of Fijian society. We've never seen that kind of political upheaval when Rambuka stormed into parliament and took over government.
Then parliament was sitting, and Rambuka walks in, and he had a pistol in his hand. He then asked all the government members to come out and go into the military trucks with armed soldiers, and they're taken straight to the military camp.
I believe it is in the national interest that I carry out the events of this morning.
The first coup were held hostage for 5 days only, and then were released later.
Again with that ever-present colonial legacy of us and them, Rambuka's coup had immense support from Indigenous Fijians. After handing the government back for civilian rule, but dissatisfied and fearing the gains of his first coup in May would be lost, Rambuka staged a second coup in September of 1987, aggregating the constitution and declaring Fiji a republic.
It was a full-scale military rule.
While many Fijians supported the indigenous rights issues at the forefront of the coups, Fiji became a police state that many could not live under. The doors to the Fiji Sun were closed, and Ruthi's confidence in journalism in Fiji was gone. So shortly after the coup, she left for Auckland.
So I've lived here in New Zealand for 30 years, and journalism is different. We've got so much freedom to write, criticize the government, criticize the police, and unfortunately this is a privilege that my colleagues do not have in Fiji.
Rambuka would hand over power to an interim government, and in 1999, in a historic first for Fiji, Mahendra Chaudhry was democratically elected as the first Indo-Fijian Prime Minister, leading the multiracial Fiji Labour Party.
In the cabinet that I formed as Prime Minister, there were 18 cabinet ministers, of which 12 were Indigenous Fijians and only 6 were Indians.
But this new Indo-Fijian-led government angered hardline Tauke Indigenous Fijians, and hints at potential land reforms caused alarm. A year to the day that Chaudhry was elected, Fiji's third coup took place. This time, a civilian coup led by disgruntled businessman George Speight, who took Chaudhry and most of his cabinet and staff hostage for 56 days, while Speight attempted to negotiate with President Ratu Serkamasesi Mara.
We were in Parliament for 56 days as hostages. We all had a pretty tough time in there. We were abused and threatened. So it was a very, very nasty experience.
We would like them to leave, have the hostages released, return all arms, so we can bring back some form of normalcy back to our lives.
You know, the military should think again about trying to impose a moral standard on my group when they themselves in 1987 did the same thing.
And in that period, we were incommunicado. We didn't know what was happening outside. Then when we came out, we found that, the military had taken over. The president had been removed, and we had a military government.
After the long siege, George Speight was arrested, put on trial, and sentenced to life in prison.
Who's going to win the what? Who's going to win the rugby? Oh, All Blacks, of course.
Military Commander Commodore Vorengi Bainimarama would eventually hand over the government to a pro-Indigenous party led by the new Prime Minister, Laisenia Ngarase. But allegations of corruption within Ngarase's government led to widespread dissent. And just 6 years after he appointed Ngarase as Prime Minister, Commodore Bainimarama, citing an amnesty deal between George Speight and the government, staged his own coup.
As of 6 o'clock this evening, the military has taken over the government, has executive authority, and the running of this country.
He released a statement in which he gave his reasons. And the major one was that the Ngarase government had become too corrupt.
Bainimarama took complete control of the government and moved to silence any of the Ngarase supporters.
So I think one of the impacts of the coup culture was how this them and us mentality emerged between business people, between private sector activists, between people that you wouldn't normally see within the whole governance picture. And it became very clear that there were certain people that were favoured and certain people that were not. And if you were not, eventually, sooner or later, you ended up facing tough times.
I was viewed by the military as one of the supporters of the Ngarase government who are racist.
Allegations of corruption against Frank and other business contractors of the Ngarase government were rife, and the new military government took a hard line. Frank Rombanu Kandavu believed he was in grave danger.
I could be dead. They're not guaranteeing me that I'll be alive.
Politically, relations between Fiji and New Zealand soured, both countries banishing each other's foreign diplomats. Over the past 13 years, Frank rebuilt his life in New Zealand, while Bainimarama rebuilt his government. In 2014, after 8 years of military rule, Bainimarama was democratically elected Prime Minister. And in 2019, the military soldiers of the past coups, Rambuka and Bainimarama, went head-to-head in an election that saw Bainimarama retain his seat in power by a slim majority.
With responsible leadership in the country, there is no need to fear about racial tensions or violence. I think we get along pretty fine. But from time to time, and of course I've said it before and I say also today, that the military is a problem in this country.
My view is very straightforward, is that they acquired the military culture from Britain and from New Zealand, because New Zealand was actually in charge of the Fiji military during World War II. So I think it's an imported military culture.
For us, we're just a little baby that's trying to find its way. And I think the instances of where we cannot agree and there's coups and there's disruptions, sort of teething problems of us trying to become something or trying to grow as a nation state.
For Frank, condemned for corruption in Fiji, Aotearoa has become the home he and his family are grateful for.
You know, we will never go back to Fiji. We have to accept the fact that we will never set foot in Fiji again. And we've got to also accept the fact that Aotearoa is home now. I want to thank New Zealand for giving us, for allowing us here.
And I think a lot of people will just hope that Bainimarama would wake up to the fact that Fijians are feeling a little bit more isolated every day from what is, they think intrinsically theirs. So hopefully things will get better.
Precious moments are worth my
Ona merecias,